about the fog and the jamming, and also about a guidebook that you'll have access to in a few moments. It is my pleasure to welcome Catherine Gabet. Catherine, I love your title, very, very much James Bondy worthy. You are the Deputy Director of Spectrum Control. We're going to speak a little about espionage as well. The Spectre in French is actually the National Service for Espionage, Counter-Espionage, Terrorism, Retaliation, and Extortion. Well, actually, my service is all about protecting the spectrum, but not the kind of James Bond Spectre. Okay, so we have already tackled the topic of jamming. And in the air industry, to go to China, you had 300 kilometers that sometimes you were navigating blindly. So quite quickly, can you define jamming for us? And spoofing as well. Okay, that's a word I think that's not so new. Okay. Let's start with an illustration of jamming, which is not recent, but most definitely still very much in line with the current events. This is black humor straight from the 80s. Jamming and spoofing are interferences. So you're going to interfere with radio frequencies. With jamming, you're going to make it impossible for receptors to receive your GPS, Galileo, Jonas, or Baidu. And spoofing means you're going to send out deceiving signals, whereby you'll think that in front of you you have the real GPS, Galileo, and you can even have multi-constellation sensors to send ships in the wrong direction with the wrong timing, and that's going to completely overwhelm the equipment of the ships. So spoofing is more problematic than jamming, but jamming in itself can be problematic. In both cases, you're looking at cyber attacks. GNSS data are under attack due to these interferences, and with spoofing you actually attack the very integrity of data. So ISO standards will be impacted along the way. So your IT security framework. Okay, so the title of this illustration reads, following a severe navigation mistake, our ship is now going towards the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, so how hard it is to perform jamming? Well, actually, GPS jamming is rather simple because GPS signals arrive at surface level at a very weak level, 1 million times lower than that of a signal coming out of your phone, which is already low enough. So with just a little noise, with a 10-euro jammer, you're going to be able to jam a radius of 10 kilometers if there are no obstacles along the way. So with a larger device in war theaters that's currently being used as part of the electronic warfare. So you can cause a lot of damage with that. And with anti-drone jamming, you have paparazzi drones with strong frequencies, and here you can definitely cause damage and harm for a lot of people. Well, earlier on you spoke to me about a Pokemon story. What was that about? Can you tell everyone about it? Well, not necessarily something related to the maritime industry, but our spectrum control agents check proactively the GPS when they're back from processing mission to check on a jamming operation. And on the way between Antibes and Nice, they realized that there was an integrated jamming device on their car, so they followed it up until Nice, where the person parked. They called on OPG because, you know, when you have a jamming device, one never knows who's really behind that, you know, who's tracking who. And you really want to be able to recover that jamming device as quickly as you can. And as we were waiting for the police, our agent asked that person, why do you have a jamming device in your car? And the answer was, well, I live uphill on Nice, and back then people were chasing Pokemons and they would go into my garden. So that was a way for me to protect myself from Pokemons. So he had that in his car, but not really sure why, but for the airport that was nearby, that might actually be a problem. Very often the civil aviation calls upon us to solve these problems. How expensive are jamming devices? Can you buy it online? Well, you have jamming devices that you can use for civil kind of uses, which shouldn't even happen in the first place because it's illegal. Unfortunately, it's quite cheap. You can find it online from Asian countries. It's really hard to counter that because platforms only have to remove these jamming device pages after they've been flagged, not beforehand. Recently, there was a case with the Paris enforcement forces. They went out and bought jamming device and other pieces of equipment as part of an undercover operation. But, you know, jamming devices can be used by burglars. Okay, so what about spoofing? Somewhat more of a recent word, at least for the public at large. Okay, so spoofing. GNSS spoofing. Well, GNSS spoofing is pretty much akin to AIS jamming. So basically, it's just as easy to jam the signals of ships and planes. Well, GNSS can be used for both, but AIS is used to follow up on the position of ships and for anti-collision purposes. So with spoofing, you have deceiving and false signals that are sent. A false and deceiving signal is the definition that was given by the IUT. ITU. And for the moment, there isn't much harmonization from a regulatory standpoint, but we're working on this so as to encourage countries to adopt harmonized regulations in this sense. Okay, so since yesterday morning, we have heard a good few times about this. So has this become a hot topic? Okay, so in red, you have the jamming and spoofing hotspots. Okay, so that's the GPS jam map that's available online. But you have other maps. This one is based on plane data, because they need their GPS as well. And their ADSB, that's retransmitted by being analyzed, can give indications, and pilot maps with jamming areas. So you can have conflict zones or jamming in non-conflict zones, in France, for example. Whether it be a small jamming device in the car, as we saw with the story that I told you, or a grandmother. There you have it. There was a grandmother. She had an internet set-top box that had been mishandled and had been turned into a jamming device. You can also have jamming against drones that might cause harm during presidential journeys. And geopolitical conflicts also play a role here, and that can cause a number of problems. The last time I parked my yacht in Monaco, it didn't happen so well. Well, actually, we focus on France. But it may so happen. But we have limited jamming, but still problematic nonetheless. 500 meters or 2 kilometers around. And in November of 2019, there was a case of jamming. We were alerted by the airport of Vire-Toulon, Nice, half of the airspace of the south of France. The army called me. Quite nice it was during a weekend. Anyway, they're supposed to have their own processes to process that GCSA, DGSA level, and with the civil aviation. But this being said, we needed to know where this was coming from. This was not a military exercise, and we would have been warned had that been the case. Anyway, and we were 99.9999 sure that there was a foreign flag super yacht, probably the second largest yacht in the La Ciotat port, that was using an anti-paparazzi drone system, and in the press it was very clearly said that they had that kind of a system, and it stopped on the Sunday night because all of that happened on the Saturday and Sunday. Agents had been sent out in the field during the weekend, and it stopped before they reached to the yacht, but they crossed data. And the day after, we went on board of the yacht to explain ourselves, but it's quite concerning because large-scale jamming is on the rise. We're developing processes, and we're working in cooperation with the gendarme enforcement authorities, the Air Force as well. That's in these current times. Such scenarios are more and more frequent, and this being said, we're not alone in that case. There have been similar cases of fortuitous jamming in the north of France, and it affected the entire Belgium-French airspace in the north. Okay, so what about Hormuz? I mean, for me, it was pretty much similar to what may happen in other conflict theaters, but it's a school case in the sense that it's a strait, so all the ships are bound to be blocked very quickly. On day one of the conflict, 1,100 ships were jammed in the strait, so a lot happened very quickly. So something to be aware of and to bear in mind. I mean, first of all, you want to avoid these areas. Aircrafts do not necessarily do that. But, you know, the world today is much more complicated than it used to. So having that awareness can only be good. Okay, very concretely, we have at least one pilot here and a good few ship owners in the room. What would be your recommendation? Yes, sorry, I changed the order in my questions. So, what practical advice can you share with everyone that may be sailing and may be exposed to the risk of jamming? A great philosopher in the person of Jean-Claude Van Damme once said, for those of you that know him, apologies for our English speakers here, because this is an actor that's not necessarily known internationally. Anyway, his philosophy is probably known around the world, though. It's quite funny. So be aware. Be aware. That's number one. Hormuz. Be aware. That is a possibility. Airspace, same applies. Do not jam yourself. And know what you need to do in order to be more resilient when faced with that threat. So first of all, study your maps. Make sure you do not enter any such space that's exposed to jamming risks. And we've also written a guidebook. In the Ceuta case, for example, all of the ships had lost their GPS signal for 2 days. And when we got there, they said, "You have not alerted us. No one has alerted us." And that's following this case that we also decided to draft this guidebook, because alerting the agency of frequency is part of the answer, depending on your flight. So there was an interministerial delegation that also pushed for the drafting of that guidebook, along with the Ministry of Transportation. Yes, there you go. That's the guidebook in question. You can scan the QR code and you'll be redirected to the French version of the guidebook. And here's the QR code for the English version. So my main piece of advice is make sure that jamming is one extra line you add to your risks. Don't forget about jamming. So take a look at everything that's happening around you, and the guidebook will be very helpful in the sense that it's a first line of action. Know how to detect. Well, actually, how can you realize that you've been spoofed? Well, it might be that you realize that you have these teleportation jumps, but it can be more subtle than that. With GPS, GNSS, Galileo, GPS kind of systems, with a double identification system allowing you to reject these signals. Jamming should be easier to detect because you have alerts. You have certain systems that can send out alerts. You can have inconsistencies between the AIS, ACTEN, and the radar and the map. If the time is changing, well, you may have a watch that's not connected to your GNSS. That could be handy. Robustness, detection. We're not asking you to detect the actual jamming, but rather to detect that there's a risk of jamming. And actually, the US are training their marine to these methods, and there are new systems on the way with air mode, for example, which will be tested in the Baltic Sea with a much stronger signals in lower bandwidth and lower satellite constellations that can send out stronger signals. That's another possibility. Or you have other alternative systems. Many solutions exist. But risk analysis, I would say, comes first, knowing how to detect. You can also install a sensor that will tell you whether you've been spoofed or jammed, and that can be useful. Okay, so apart from the jamming, what else do you do? Well, a few things. The National Agency for Frequency is planifying the spectrum of frequencies for all for maritime affairs, for the civil aviation, for the audiovisual industry, for the Ministry of Interior, etc. So we manage the entire spectrum. Every 4 years, we plan new developments because there are new services on the way. 6G for mobile phones, for example, in an environment characterized by many rules, so very complex. And on the spectrum control side, we proactively protect. So we control on land systems, but also on board of ships to make sure that they're fully compliant. And we also process the jamming cases that are signaled to us. And internationally, we also share with our peers to work on our best practices, our processes, our equipment as well. We innovate constantly, and also regulations domestically and internationally to make sure that we have the right capacities proportionate to the risks. At the agency, there are 300 of us, and at Spectrum Control, around 100. And we also have regional sites and overseas. We actually have the time to take a couple of questions, but I will not give you my microphone, dear Pascal, but I know that a mic is on the way. Thank you very much, Madame Gabet. We've exchanged throughout the year. Thank you so much for this extremely interesting presentation. Here's my direct question. The ANFR, does it have a police function? Well, we have the power to investigate any crime related to this. But we're very proportionate, obviously. The whole set-top box jamming did not lead to any financial sanction. And it was not a Russian hacker that presented himself as a granny either, which could have been possible. In order to avoid any problem related to the GNSS, certain fleets are looking to reactivate the Lorenzi and Iloran networks. Any concrete initiatives to this effect? Well, I think that the Brits are very much in favor of this. The Iloran still exists in a number of countries, starting with Korea, I think. In France, I know that this is up for discussion right now. But the GPS, GNSS, Galileo, all of that should not be thrown in the bin. Now you have Galileo with identification, ERPS for the military, but you can also have encrypted anti-spoofing systems that will be adopted in the future. But you need alternative solutions, and that's part of the things we're looking into. Air mode in Baltic countries, you know, they're jammed all the time, so they have been promoting these tests. There are European projects on this. And then you have low orbit satellite constellations. You can also look at the relay antennas. That's another way. But you just want to make sure that whatever new method you're adopting, it's not going against existing methods that are useful.
If there was only one takeaway, what would it be? I've got 3 words. That's not one thing. But be aware, that's essential. Be aware that there's no zero risk. Now, people are aware of that, unfortunately, because of the news. Be aware that there is no zero risk either in countries that are not at war because you're close or because people are also using that for more traditional criminal activities. And risk analysis that needs to be part of your cyber risk portfolio, digital risk also, that's part of that arsenal. That dovetails very well with cyber risk, but it's not the same response as a traditional IT attack. And you need to know what your frequency regulation agency is. It's ANFR in France. But even if it's intra-country jamming, then the country will challenge the country that is the source of the jamming, and knowing where the jamming comes from, the jamming or spoofing comes from, is essential for us to be able to address it, because the final remediation is to kill the source of jamming. We can do that 99% of the time if we know where it is, and then also provide sanctions to avoid it reoccurring, and also knowing how many cases there are to be prepared. It costs a lot to have specific equipment. We need to change regulations to address that, but it really depends on the situation as we can see it, and so figures are important. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, everybody. It's now time for a break. The discussion will resume in half an hour at 4:35 with Catherine Laurent. I'm sorry, but I'll have to say goodbye. I have personal reasons to leave you now, but enjoy the rest of Paris Mat and see you next year, probably.